The massive crystal halls of the Galactic Council gleamed under artificial suns as High Counselor Veleth reviewed the morning's paperwork. His 6 eyes scanned through dozens of applications from primitive species across the galaxy, each one begging for the honor of joining civilized space. Most would be rejected outright, their technology too crude or their cultures too violent for proper galactic society. One application caught his attention, not because it was impressive, but because it was so utterly mundane. The species called themselves humans and came from a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in the outer rim. Their faster-than-light technology was barely functional, held together with what their own reports described as duct tape and hope. Their largest warship was smaller than most galactic pleasure craft, and their understanding of quantum physics was laughably primitive, Veleth's assistant. A floating blob of sentient gas named Morpheus drifted over to examine the human application. The creature's thoughts rippled through the air in visible waves of purple and gold. It found the humans amusing in the way that small children might find a dancing pet entertaining. These humans had somehow convinced themselves they belonged among the stars, despite being little more than angry apes who had learned to bang rocks together in space. The xenobiology report was even more damning. Humans were classified as an aggressive predator species with an unusual tendency to form emotional attachments to other life forms. They kept smaller animals as companions, treating them almost like family members. This alone marked them as dangerously unstable by galactic standards. Civilized species maintained proper emotional distance from lesser beings. What truly puzzled the Council scientists was human reproduction. Unlike most intelligent species, humans formed long-term mating bonds and actually enjoyed the process of creating offspring. They even had a concept called marriage, where 2 individuals promised to share resources for their entire lifespan. The very idea was absurd to species that had evolved beyond such primitive biological drives. Despite all these red flags, High Counselor Veleth decided to grant the humans provisional membership status. The decision was not based on any merit the species possessed, but rather on galactic law itself. Section 2847 of the membership accord stated that any species capable of faster-than-light travel must be given the opportunity to prove their worth. Over a probationary period of no less than 50 standard years, the humans would be given a seat in the outer rim of the council chambers, far from any real decision-making power. They would be allowed to observe galactic governance and slowly learn their place in the cosmic order. Most species took centuries to understand even the basics of galactic law, and humans seemed particularly slow compared to the average applicant. Ambassador David Walsh arrived at the council station 3 weeks later aboard a ship that barely qualified as space-worthy. The human delegation consisted of only 12 individuals, a laughably small number compared to the hundreds of representatives that most species brought to their first council meeting. Walsh himself was an unremarkable specimen, middle-aged by human standards with graying hair, and the soft appearance of someone who spent too much time behind a desk. The other council members barely acknowledged the human presence as they filed into the great assembly hall. The Drakmori delegation, tall reptilian beings with scales that shifted color based on their mood, whispered among themselves about the new arrivals. Their translator picked up fragments of conversation describing humans as primitive mammals who had somehow stumbled into space through pure luck. The Alterian Collective, a hive mind species that spoke in perfect harmony, openly discussed whether humans would even survive their first year in galactic society. Their calculations suggested a 97% probability that the species would destroy itself through internal conflict before reaching technological maturity. The remaining 3% accounted for the possibility that they would be conquered by a more advanced neighbor. Ambassador Walsh seemed completely unaware of the condescending attitude surrounding him as he settled into the designated human seating area. His translation device, a crude mechanical affair that required constant adjustment, struggled with the complex harmonics of galactic standard language. He spent several minutes fumbling with the controls while other delegates watched with barely concealed amusement. What none of them realized was that Walsh had been preparing for this moment for over 30 years. While the galaxy assumed humans had only recently achieved spaceflight, the truth was that they had been intercepting galactic communications for decades. A small team of human scientists had managed to decode enough alien transmissions to understand basic galactic language and culture long before making official contact. More importantly, Walsh had brought with him something that no other species had ever considered necessary: a complete legal analysis of galactic law. Hidden in his simple briefcase were 17,000 pages of translated statutes, regulations, and legal precedents that human lawyers had spent years studying. They had identified over 4,000 potential contradictions and loopholes. In the existing legal framework, the humans had also done something that shocked their future alien allies. They had actually read the fine print. While most species relied on cultural understanding and traditional interpretations of galactic law, humans approached it like engineers analyzing a technical manual. They looked for exactly what was written rather than what was meant to be written. During the formal welcome ceremony, High Counselor Veleth delivered the standard speech about the responsibilities and limitations of provisional membership. He explained that humans would need to prove their worth through decades of careful observation and gradual integration into galactic society. They would start with minor trade agreements and work their way up to more significant responsibilities over the course of several centuries. Ambassador Walsh listened politely to the entire presentation, nodding at appropriate moments and asking clarifying questions through his struggling translation device. When the ceremony concluded, he submitted the human response, a formal acceptance of provisional membership status along with their first official request for council consideration. The request seemed innocent enough. The Terran Mining Consortium wanted permission to establish operations in an abandoned region of space known as the Kepler Belt. The area had been classified as uninhabitable due to extreme radiation levels and unstable asteroid fields. No sensible species had ever shown interest in the region, making it perfect for a species that needed to start small and prove themselves worthy of larger opportunities. High Counselor Veleth approved the request without a second thought. If the humans wanted to risk their primitive ships and crude technology in one of the most dangerous regions of space, that was their choice. A galaxy would learn within a few months whether these newcomers had what it took to survive among the stars, or whether they would become another cautionary tale about species that reach too far too fast. 6 months after the humans established their mining operation in the Kepler Belt, the galaxy began to take notice. What had started as a death wish by a primitive species had somehow transformed into the most profitable mining venture in 3 sectors. The Terran Mining Consortium was extracting rare earth elements that galactic civilization desperately needed, and they were selling these materials at prices that made established mining cartels look like thieves. The first sign of trouble came when the Alterian Collective's quarterly profit reports showed a 15% decline in rare earth sales. Their mining operations in the safe, regulated zones of civilized space simply could not compete with whatever the humans were doing in that radioactive nightmare of an asteroid field. The Alterians had spent centuries perfecting their extraction methods, using advanced technology that could strip mine an entire planet in mere weeks while maintaining perfect environmental standards. Captain Rex Stardust of the merchant vessel Profit Margin was the first galactic citizen to actually visit the human operation. What he found defied every assumption about how mining should work. Instead of the massive ships and planetary-scale equipment that civilized species used, the humans had deployed thousands of small automated drones. These machines swarmed through the asteroid field like insects, each one designed to handle specific types of extraction tasks. The radiation that kept other species away was actually being used by the humans as a power source. Their facilities were built deep inside the largest asteroids, using the rock itself as natural shielding while tapping into the ambient radiation through some sort of collection system that Captain Stardust could not understand. The entire operation looked less like a mining facility and more like a mechanical ecosystem that had evolved to thrive in the harsh environment. What truly amazed the captain was the efficiency of the operation, where galactic mining corporations required massive crews and expensive equipment. The humans were accomplishing the same results with a staff of less than 50 people. Most of the actual work was done by artificial intelligence systems that seemed to learn and adapt to new challenges in real time. The Syndicate of Worlds, a powerful trade federation that controlled most of the galaxy's mining operations, was not pleased with this development. Their representative, a massive Korthic warrior named Grim Ironscale, demanded an immediate meeting with the Galactic Council. Standing over 3 meters tall with natural armor plating and claws that could tear through starship hull, Grim was accustomed to getting his way through a combination of legal pressure and barely contained threats of violence. Grim's complaint was straightforward. The human mining operation was clearly unsafe and should be shut down immediately. No species could possibly survive the radiation levels in the Kepler belt without suffering massive genetic damage. The humans were either lying about their operation or they were conducting illegal experiments that violated galactic health and safety standards. Ambassador Walsh attended the hearing with a simple briefcase and a smile that made several council members uncomfortable. When called upon to respond to the charges, he calmly pulled out a stack of documents that had been prepared months in advance. Section 4271 of the Galactic Commerce Code clearly stated that any species could establish operations in regions deemed unsuitable for their own physiology, provided they filed proper environmental impact assessments. The humans had filed 847 different environmental impact assessments, each one technically compliant with galactic law. They had also invoked subsection 12C of the Frontier Development Act, which encouraged innovative solutions to resource acquisition challenges. Furthermore, they had submitted detailed medical reports proving that their radiation exposure levels were within acceptable limits for human physiology. Grim Ironscale objected that no species could possibly have physiology that allowed them to work in such extreme conditions. Ambassador Walsh politely noted that the Commerce Code made no distinction between natural and artificial tolerance. The humans were using protective equipment and medical treatments that allowed them to operate safely in the radiation environment. High Counselor Veleth found himself in an uncomfortable position. The humans had followed every regulation to the letter, filing more paperwork than most species submitted in their first decade of membership. Their operation was clearly successful and was actually providing benefits to galactic commerce by increasing the supply of rare materials. There was no legal basis for shutting them down. The real shock came when Walsh submitted additional documents. The humans were not just planning to continue their current operation, but were requesting permission to expand into 7 other hazardous regions that galactic civilization had written off as unusable. Each request was backed by detailed technical specifications and environmental impact studies that must have taken years to prepare. The Syndicate of Worlds representatives began to realize they were facing something unprecedented. Every other species in galactic history had started with safe, simple operations and gradually worked their way up to more challenging environments. The humans were deliberately seeking out the most dangerous and profitable locations right from the beginning. Captain Stardust, who had been called as a witness to describe the human operation, found himself defending them despite his initial skepticism. The human facility was actually cleaner and more environmentally responsible than most galactic mining operations. They were extracting materials without destroying the asteroid field and were even cleaning up contamination left behind by previous failed mining attempts. The debate continued for hours as various trade representatives argued that the humans were somehow cheating or breaking rules that everyone else followed. Walsh patiently responded to each objection with specific legal citations and technical documentation. The humans had studied galactic law more thoroughly than species that had been members for centuries. The final blow came when Walsh presented the humans' trade proposals. They were offering to sell their extracted materials at 30% below current market rates while maintaining higher purity standards than existing suppliers. They were also offering technology sharing agreements that would allow other species to benefit from human innovations in extreme environment operations. The Galactic Council had no choice but to approve the human expansion requests. Every legal expert they consulted confirmed that the humans had followed proper procedures and met all requirements. The Syndicate of Worlds' attempt to shut down the competition had not only failed, but had actually given the humans official approval to expand their operations across multiple star systems. As the council session ended, High Counselor Veleth began to suspect that the humans were not the simple, primitive species they appeared to be. Their legal knowledge was too precise, their planning too detailed, and their execution too flawless for a species that had supposedly just learned about galactic law. The possibility that they had been preparing for this moment much longer than anyone realized was starting to seem very likely. Grim Ironscale left the chambers defeated but not discouraged. The Syndicate would find other ways to deal with the human problem. They had resources and connections that a small primitive species could never match. The humans might have won this battle through legal trickery, but the war was far from over. The hegemony of the Crimson Suns had been expanding their empire for over 2 centuries, conquering smaller species and incorporating their worlds through a combination of military might and political intimidation. And their latest target was the human colony world of New Brisbane, a small agricultural planet that had been settled only 15 years earlier by Terran pioneers seeking a quiet life away from the crowded homeworld. War Marshal Theric Bloodclaw studied the intelligence reports on human military capabilities with growing confidence. The entire human space fleet consisted of fewer than 300 ships, most of which were converted civilian vessels with hastily installed weapons. Their largest warship was smaller than a standard hegemony patrol craft, and their defensive technology was at least 50 years behind galactic standards. The human colony on New Brisbane represented everything the hegemony despised about weak species. The colonists had established small farms and peaceful communities instead of building proper military installations. They grew crops and raised livestock like primitive farmers, showing no understanding of how civilized species should utilize planetary resources. The entire planet could be conquered by a single hegemony battle group. General Marcus Reed received the ultimatum while sitting in his modest office in the colony's administrative center. The message was delivered through standard galactic diplomatic channels, translated into human language by automated systems that struggled with the aggressive tone of hegemony communication. The colony had 3 standard galactic days to surrender unconditionally or face orbital bombardment that would reduce their settlements to radioactive ash. Reed was not an impressive figure by galactic standards. He was a middle-aged human with a slight build and gray hair who had served as a logistics officer before retiring to colonial administration. His military experience consisted of managing supply chains and coordinating civilian evacuations during natural disasters. The Hegemony Intelligence Service had dismissed him as a harmless bureaucrat who would collapse under pressure. What the Hegemony did not understand was that Reed had spent his entire career studying military history. Not just human conflicts, but every major war in galactic records. He had analyzed thousands of battles, searching for patterns and strategies that might be useful to a species that could never hope to match alien technology or firepower. His conclusion was that humans would need to fight smarter rather than harder. Reed's response to the ultimatum was brief and formal. He transmitted an official message stating that the human colony formally surrendered all military assets in the New Brisbane system to the hegemony of the Crimson Suns, as defined under Article 847 of the Galactic War Accords. The surrender would take effect immediately upon the arrival of hegemony forces to accept custody of the designated assets. War. Marshal Theric was pleased but not surprised by the quick surrender. Most primitive species collapsed when faced with overwhelming force, and humans were clearly no exception. The hegemony fleet moved toward New Brisbane, expecting to find a defeated colony ready to accept their new masters. They planned to use the planet as a staging ground for further expansion into human space. The first sign that something was wrong came when the hegemony scouts detected massive energy signatures from the planet's surface. Long-range sensors showed what appeared to be industrial-scale disassembly operations taking place across the entire colony. Huge machines were systematically dismantling buildings, processing plants, and infrastructure at incredible speed when the main fleet arrived. At New Brisbane 3 days later, they found the planet completely empty. Every human, every piece of equipment, every building, and even the livestock had vanished without a trace. The only things left behind were carefully maintained agricultural fields and a few small monuments, marking the locations where the original settlements had stood. War Marshal Thyrick was furious and confused. His intelligence reports had confirmed over 40,000 human colonists on the planet just 1 week earlier. An entire civilization could not simply disappear in 3 days, especially not with the primitive technology that humans possessed. There had to be some explanation for what had happened. The answer came when Thyrick reviewed General Reed's surrender message more carefully. Reed had surrendered all military assets as defined under galactic law, but he had been very specific about the terminology. The colonists had been reclassified as civilian refugees, the buildings had been redesignated as portable emergency shelters, and all equipment had been registered as humanitarian aid supplies. Under galactic law, civilian populations could not be targeted during military operations and had the right to evacuation assistance. The humans had simply exercised their legal right to relocate their entire colony to a safer location. They had even filed the proper paperwork with the Galactic Refugee Commission, requesting emergency transport assistance for a population threatened by military action. The hegemony had expected to capture a planet full of resources and slave labor. Instead, they found themselves the legal owners of empty farmland and a handful of monuments. The humans had stripped their colony down to the molecular level and relocated everything to a previously unknown star system deep in unexplored space. The real surprise came when the hegemony tried to leave New Brisbane. Their ship's engines would not start. Their computers were displaying error messages in languages that their translators could not identify, and their communication systems were broadcasting what appeared to be human music throughout the fleet. The mighty war machines of the Crimson Suns had been reduced to expensive metal sculptures orbiting an empty planet during the surrender negotiations. Human engineers have been allowed aboard hegemony vessels to transfer technical specifications, as required by galactic law. The transfer process was supposed to provide the conquering force with detailed information about colonial infrastructure and defensive capabilities. What the hegemony had failed to notice was that the data transfer had gone both ways. The human engineers had installed microscopic electromagnetic pulse devices throughout the hegemony fleet's computer systems. These devices were activated by a simple radio signal broadcast from the planet's surface just before the last human transport left the system. Every critical system on every hegemony ship was now completely inoperable. General Reed appeared on the main communication screen of the hegemony flagship with the same mild expression he had worn during the surrender negotiations. He politely informed War Marshal Thyrick that replacement computer cores were available for purchase from the Terran Defense Consortium at very reasonable prices. The humans would even provide installation services and technical support to ensure that the hegemony fleet could return home safely. The cost of the replacement parts was exactly equal to the value of the resources that the hegemony had expected to loot from New Brisbane. Reed explained that this was purely coincidental and that the humans were simply trying to be helpful neighbors. The alternative was for the hegemony fleet to remain in orbit around an empty planet until their life support systems failed. War Marshal Thyrick had no choice but to accept the human offer. The hegemony paid for their own rescue and limped home with the knowledge that they had been defeated without a single shot being fired. The story of their humiliation spread quickly through galactic military circles, establishing humans as a species that was far more dangerous than their primitive technology suggested. The galaxy began to realize that humans did not fight wars the way civilized species expected. They did not meet force with force or attempt to prove their courage through glorious battle. Instead, they used rules and regulations as weapons, turning the enemy's own legal system against them while maintaining perfect compliance with galactic law. The Alterian Collective prided themselves on being the galaxy's premier intelligence service. Their spy networks had infiltrated every major government, corporation, and military organization in known space. They knew the secret weaknesses of species that had been galactic powers for millennia and had detailed psychological profiles of every important leader in civilized space. When the Collective decided to investigate the humans more thoroughly, they assigned their best operative to the mission. Agent Blue 7 was a master of infiltration, who had successfully posed as members of over 30 different species during her 2-century career. Her shape-changing abilities and perfect memory made her ideally suited for long-term undercover operations. The plan was simple. Blue 7 would assume the identity of a minor trade, attach in the human diplomatic corps, and spend several months gathering intelligence on human capabilities and intentions. The Collective expected to uncover a species of clever but ultimately primitive beings who had gotten lucky with a few legal victories but posed no real threat to galactic stability. Blue 7's first surprise came during the application process for her cover identity. The Human Diplomatic Service required background checks that were more thorough than some species used for their military intelligence officers. They wanted detailed personal histories, psychological evaluations, and even genetic analysis to ensure that applicants were suitable for representing humanity in galactic affairs. More puzzling was the human interview process. Instead of asking about her qualifications or experience, the interviewers focused on hypothetical scenarios and ethical dilemmas. They wanted to know how she would handle situations where galactic law conflicted with human values, or where following regulations might harm innocent people. The questions suggested a level of philosophical sophistication that the Collective had not expected from such a young species. When Blue 7 finally gained access to human diplomatic facilities, what she discovered defied every assumption the galaxy had made about humanity. The human legal corps was not just a handful of diplomats and lawyers working out of converted cargo containers. It was a vast network of thousands of legal experts, backed by quantum computers that could analyze legal precedent faster than most species could think. The humans had created detailed psychological profiles of every major alien species, understanding not just what they would do in various situations, but how they would interpret rules and regulations. They knew which species valued honor over profit, which ones made decisions based on emotion rather than logic, and which ones could be manipulated through appeals to their cultural traditions. Most shocking of all was the human concept of malicious compliance. While every other species in the galaxy tried to follow the spirit of galactic law, humans had weaponized the letter of the law. They would follow regulations exactly as written, but in ways that produced outcomes the lawmakers never intended. They treated legal codes like engineering manuals, looking for ways to achieve their goals within the technical specifications rather than the intended purpose. Blue 7 watched human lawyers prepare for a routine trade negotiation with the Draconian Republic. The preparation process involved 17 different legal experts, 3 cultural specialists, and a team of psychologists who analyzed every word choice and phrase structure in the proposed agreements. They identified 43 potential loopholes in the Draconian contract language and prepared responses for each one. The negotiation itself was a masterpiece of legal misdirection. The human team appeared to make significant concessions on mineral rights and shipping routes, giving the Draconians exactly what they thought they wanted. What the Draconians failed to notice was that the humans had redefined several key terms in ways that completely changed the meaning of the agreement. The mineral rights that the Draconians thought they had gained applied only to elements that existed naturally in concentrations above a certain threshold. The humans planned to extract the same materials using processing techniques that would technically classify them as artificial compounds. The shipping routes that seemed so favorable to the Draconians were actually more expensive to use than the alternatives, but the contract language made it impossible for them to change course without paying massive penalties. Blue 7, realized that the humans were not just lucky or clever. They were systematic in their approach to galactic politics, treating every interaction as a complex puzzle to be solved through careful analysis and strategic thinking. They had studied their opponents more thoroughly than most species studied themselves. The depth of human preparation became clear when Blue 7 attempted to access classified information about human military capabilities. Instead of the crude defenses she expected to find, she discovered that the humans had been tracking her activities from the moment she arrived. They knew she was a spy, they knew which intelligence service she worked for, and they had been feeding her carefully curated information designed to test the collective's knowledge and capabilities. Ambassador Walsh personally delivered her extraction orders along with a complete dossier on her real identity and mission objectives. He thanked her for participating in what he called a valuable cultural exchange program, and noted that her presence had been very educational for both species. The humans had learned important details about Alterian intelligence methods while providing the collective with enough accurate information to seem cooperative. The final revelation came when Blue 7 discovered the true scope of human intelligence operations. While the Alterian collective had been focused on gathering information about human activities, the humans had been systematically mapping the entire galactic intelligence network. They knew which species were spying on whom, how information flowed between different organizations, and where the major power centers actually existed. The humans had identified corruption networks that spanned multiple star systems, trade conspiracies that had been manipulating galactic markets for decades, and political alliances that existed only in secret. They had gathered enough evidence to expose scandals that would topple governments and reshape the balance of power throughout civilized space. What made this discovery truly terrifying was that the humans were not using this information for blackmail or political gain. They were simply collecting it as part of their systematic analysis of how galactic society actually functioned. They wanted to understand the real rules that governed alien behavior, not just the official laws that everyone pretended to follow. Blue 7's final report to the Alterian collective was both comprehensive and deeply disturbing. The humans were not just another primitive species stumbling around galactic politics through luck and determination. They were strategic thinkers who approached every challenge with scientific precision and long-term planning that spanned decades or centuries. The collective's leadership found themselves facing an uncomfortable truth. Their intelligence network, which they had considered the most sophisticated in the galaxy, was based on assumptions about how civilized species behaved. The humans operated according to completely different principles, making them nearly impossible to predict or control through traditional methods. The galaxy was beginning to realize that humanity represented something unprecedented in galactic history. They were not trying to join the existing power structure or challenge it through military force. Instead, they were quietly rewriting the fundamental rules that governed how civilized species interacted, one legal precedent at a time. By the time other species noticed what was happening, the humans had already gained advantages that would be nearly impossible to reverse. The breaking point came exactly 7 years after humanity's first contact with galactic civilization. Ambassador Walsh, now accompanied by a team of 50 human legal experts, requested a formal review of the Galactic Council's founding charter. The request was submitted through proper channels with all required documentation, but its implications sent shock waves through every major government in known space. The humans had prepared for this moment with the same methodical precision they brought to every other aspect of galactic politics. Their legal team had spent years analyzing not just current galactic law, but the historical foundation upon which the entire system was built. What they discovered was a legal house of cards that had been growing more unstable with each passing century. High Counselor Veleth received the human petition with growing unease. The document was 12,000 pages long and systematically examined every treaty, agreement, and legal precedent that formed the basis of galactic governance. The humans had traced the Council's authority back to its origins, 3,000 years earlier, and identified fundamental flaws that no one had noticed or cared to address. The original Galactic Council had been established through a series of treaties signed by 27 founding species. Over the millennia, many of these species had gone extinct, been conquered, or evolved into entirely different forms of life. Their legal obligations had been transferred to successor governments through a complex web of inheritance laws and political agreements that had never been properly documented. More damaging was the discovery that the Council's charter had been amended hundreds of times without following the procedures established in the original founding documents. Each amendment required unanimous consent from all member species, but the Council had been operating under majority rule for over 1,000 years. Every law passed during that time was technically invalid under the system's own legal framework. The humans presented their findings during a special session of the Council that drew representatives from every major species in the galaxy. Ambassador Walsh stood before the assembled delegates with a calm expression that had become familiar to galactic leaders over the past 7 years. His presentation was thorough, methodical, and absolutely devastating. He began by showing that the current council had no legal authority to pass binding legislation. The original treaty structure had collapsed centuries earlier when key signatory species disappeared, but no one had bothered to establish a new legal foundation. The council had been operating on tradition and assumed consent rather than actual legal authority. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The humans had obtained copies of the original treaties from archives that most species had forgotten existed. They had traced the genealogy of every founding species and documented exactly when and how their legal obligations had been transferred or abandoned. They had even found records of council meetings where members had discussed the legal problems, but decided to ignore them for political convenience. The chamber erupted in chaos as delegates realized the implications. Every trade agreement, every territorial dispute resolution, every regulatory decision made by the Council for the past millennium was legally meaningless. The entire foundation of galactic civilization was built on nothing more than mutual agreement to pretend that the system worked. High Counselor Veleth demanded that the humans withdraw their challenge, threatening them with expulsion from galactic society. Ambassador Walsh politely noted that the Council lacked the legal authority to expel anyone, since their charter was invalid. He also pointed out that threatening legal action for presenting factual information was itself a violation of the Council's own procedural rules, the Drakmori. Delegate accused the humans of trying to destroy galactic civilization through legal technicalities. Walsh responded that they were simply pointing out problems that already existed and offering solutions. The current system was unstable and would eventually collapse on its own. The humans were providing an opportunity to fix the foundation before everything fell apart. The real shock came when Walsh presented the human alternative. Instead of trying to patch the existing system, they proposed a completely new framework, based on voluntary cooperation rather than imposed hierarchy. Each species would maintain sovereignty over their own affairs, with disputes resolved through arbitration rather than centralized authority. The new confederation would be governed by principles rather than rigid laws. Member species would agree to basic standards for trade, communication, and peaceful coexistence, but would be free to organize their internal affairs according to their own values and traditions. The system would be flexible enough to accommodate different cultures while providing stability for interstellar commerce and diplomacy. The humans offered to provide the legal framework and administrative support for the new system. Their experience with galactic law and their reputation for finding creative solutions to complex problems made them natural candidates for managing the transition. They would serve as neutral arbitrators and legal consultants rather than rulers or judges. What made the proposal truly attractive was its voluntary nature. Species that wanted to maintain the old system were free to do so among themselves. The new confederation would simply offer an alternative for those who preferred cooperation over coercion. The humans predicted that most species would gradually migrate to the new system as its advantages became apparent. The debate that followed lasted for months. as representatives returned to their home governments for consultation. The old power structures fought desperately to maintain their authority, but they could not argue with the legal facts that the humans had presented. The Council's foundation was indeed legally invalid, and continuing to operate under the old system would eventually lead to chaos. Within a year, over two-thirds of galactic civilization had signed on to the new Confederation. The old Council dissolved quietly as its members accepted advisory roles in the reformed system. The Terran Federation became the galaxy's unofficial legal department, with human lawyers and judges ensuring that the new order operated smoothly and fairly. The transition was not without challenges. Some species attempted to exploit the temporary confusion to settle old grudges or grab territory from their neighbors. The humans responded with the same methodical precision they had shown in dismantling the old system. They provided legal support to victims of aggression and used economic pressure to discourage opportunistic behavior. The Syndicate of Worlds, which had been one of the most powerful organizations under the old system, found their influence greatly reduced in the new Confederation. Their attempts to maintain control through economic manipulation were frustrated by new trade agreements that distributed resources more fairly among member species. The hegemony of the Crimson Suns discovered that military conquest was much more difficult when potential victims had access to human legal and technical support. Their expansion slowed and eventually stopped as they found themselves facing not just individual species, but an entire network of mutual defense agreements. High Counselor Veleth, now serving as an advisor rather than a ruler, reflected on the changes as he watched the new Confederation's first annual assembly. The humans had never broken a single law, never fired a shot in anger, never even raised their voices during the most heated debates. They had simply read the rules more carefully than anyone else and played the game better than its creators had ever imagined possible. The galaxy had learned too late that humans never played by the rules in the way that other species expected. They did not try to work within existing systems or challenge them through force. Instead, they understood the systems better than anyone else and used that knowledge to rewrite them entirely. The age of imposed galactic order was over, replaced by something that was both more chaotic and more fair than what had come before.